Well, hi folks, and welcome. Great to see everybody here, and enjoying the pre-chat conversations that are going on there. A lot to chat about tonight. Just before I bring Leith in, let me just do a couple of pre-show formalities. We'll stick the pre-show on just to say, hey, we're in pre-show mode. And somebody, of course, will be asking for the doggy cam. So the doggy cam is here. There you go. The doggy cam is now working. So Luna and Meteor are in their beds, sitting very comfortably and cozily whilst I make this show happen. So that's, they are alive, honestly, but they are very comfortable. And you see they've got two separate beds now rather than the mattress. So they seem to like that. Although quite often they end up with one of the dogs sitting out on the carpet. But that's another story. And again, just before hang on, Luna's moved. There you go, just to show that she's alive. Anyway, so that's that. And just as I move on to the main show, let me just remind you, of course, we're not providing specific financial or legal advice. It's the general conversation only. We do moderate the chat. This is as at the 18th of July this year. And if you'd like to ask a question, if you use that Walk the World, I get it in my queue, and that means I can see it. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means you can get your question to the top of the list, or indeed make a contribution to what we do here. And those are greatly appreciated. Helps us to cover some of the costs of doing what we do. Anyhow, that's all preamble. Now I think that what we should be doing is pushing this button and pushing this button and pushing this button. Leith, hello.
G'day, Martin. Hello, everyone. How are you?
Great to see you back on the show, and quite a lot to talk about tonight, all about housing, property and politics and related subjects.
Always, mate. Always a pleasure to chat.
Great. Well, as with all of these things, there's lots of different ways we could get into this, but I thought one of the interesting ways we could get into it was just to talk about the revelation, the announcement of the new RBA chief as at September. I did a post that basically said, new world, old world, nothing much has changed. So, and I know that you've been on Sky and a few other areas talking about this, but there are some implications, right? Because effectively it's suggesting a bit of a same old with regards to what the RBA might be doing.
Yeah, that's right. Look, basically, it's always hilarious when the Reserve Bank, or the government, I should say, undertakes like a 12-month review of the Reserve Bank, wanting to reform the bank and wanting to change all the processes, and then ends up just basically promoting the second in charge. That was the second in charge to all the so-called failures that happened under the Reserve Bank. So it was a bit of a strange. Actually, it's a strange appointment if you truly want reform, but it's probably not a strange appointment given it's Australia and that's the way it all works here. Basically, I mean, I personally would have liked to have seen someone independent, preferably someone, say, an expert from overseas come along who's, a bit reform-minded, can come into Australia with, with a fresh set of eyes, fresh way of doing things, can basically, look at how we're doing, how we can do it better, take a broom through the place maybe. But obviously instead the government's opted just for the second in charge, and obviously being a woman, I'm not against that or anything. I couldn't care less. But the fact that it is Australia's first female governor, they can sort of play that line for for the next few months, whilst kind of steering the public away from the RBA's actual failures. So I guess on one hand it's kind of predictable, but it's a bit disappointing. But that's the way it is. Unfortunately, reform does not happen very, very much in this country at all. And it's often about sort of form over substance, usually with these things. It's I guess it's the Anglosphere disease at the moment, where policy is more about virtue signaling and pretending to do things rather than actually doing it.
Yes, and just going slightly off piste here, the legislation that's in draft release at the moment, shutting down discussion on social media, is another example of turning the volume down on stuff they don't want to see. But government endorsed policies, messages are all fine, which shows you again it's form and substance. We've got it back to front.
Yeah, one thing I did like about it, though, the appointment of Michelle Bullock is that she's true Australian form and following the lead of politicians, she owns quite a property portfolio. So she actually owns apparently a $3 million principal place of residence, and as well as 4 investment properties. So um, you know it's, to me, it's not a great look. Obviously, if you've got the person who's got the hand on the trigger of interest rate rises, heavily invested in the most interest rate sensitive asset class, it doesn't have great optics in my view. But at the same time, she takes the lead from her politicians, and they're all geared up to the gills in property as well. So that's the way it is.
Well, there was a very interesting survey from New Zealand showing that politicians there, on average, had something like 3 or 4 times the property portfolios of ordinary New Zealanders. Right now, in Australia, it's a bit more hard to unpick because, of course, some of the disclosures are a bit weaker. But certainly, all the evidence suggests that politicians are leveraged up into property left, right, and centre. So you'd think that that might be a little bit of an incentive to steer the policies in a particular way rather than not. Just saying. And I think the other interesting observation here is that Bullock, of course, gave a speech about a month ago now, talking about the need probably to see unemployment a little higher, 4.5 she was suggesting. But interesting, in the minutes that came out today, there was a sort of a clear discussion about weighing up the impact on the labour market versus putting interest rates up. I have a feeling, I don't know what you think, but I think the Reserve Bank is fixated on the labour market as the sort of the cause of the problem for inflation, when I'm not sure it is.
Oh, 100%. They've said repeatedly, and this is against the advice of the OECD, the Bank for International Settlements, and a whole bunch of other bodies. The Australia Institute, for example, has done some good research on it, and they basically they keep pointing the finger at this imaginary wage price spiral that we're supposedly having, and they keep pointing out that labor costs rising at an unsustainable rate, blah blah blah, and that's driving inflation. When actually the data doesn't show that at all. It's pretty hard to argue that workers are driving inflation when basically wage growth has been about half the inflation rate. At the same time, obviously, profits have kept up nicely with inflation. So, they do seem to be overly fixated on the labour market. And I think it's just this sort of neoliberal curse. It's kind of the way they've always looked at it. And it's easier to smash, I guess, smash workers than it is to take aim at companies or profits, which is a lot harder to do. All we can really do is try and sort of, I guess, name and shame them, I suppose. But they're certainly misdiagnosing the problem, in my view. And this sort of gets back to part of the problem with monetary policy. I think I said in our last show, you basically got one lever, which is targeting 1/3 of households roughly directly, the ones who got mortgages. And it's a pretty inefficient way to basically try and control inflation anyway. And what we need is basically for the federal government to step in and pull the levers that it has. For example, number one is really fixing the energy market. Down the east coast of Australia, on July 1, basically, utility prices or electricity and gas just rose another 25%, and that's on top of a similar rise last year. And this is all basically off the surge in gas prices. And the crazy thing about it is we've actually got gas and coal prices globally are now falling, yet Australia's going up, and we're the Saudi Arabia of gas. So we're like I use this example I think a couple of times in your program, but basically what we've got now with Australia's gas price is basically akin to a Saudi Arabian going to the petrol pump and paying $2 a litre for the petrol when they actually sell it to the rest of the world. It doesn't make any sense, and that's one of the key drivers of inflation. If the Albanese government was serious in basically reducing inflation pressures throughout the economy, to be smashing the gas cartel and getting energy prices down, and also would be moderating immigration so that we don't have rents soaring at basically double-digit rates. If you look at asking rents. And rents are actually the single biggest component of CPI. So Tarek Brooker, I know he's on the show a fair bit. He's used this great analogy for Australia. He calls it the burnout economy. And it's basically where the RBA has the foot planted on the brake using interest rates, like jacking up interest rates, but the government's got the foot planted on the accelerator, running the biggest immigration program in this nation's history, which is obviously adding to, demand across the economy, pushing up rental costs, etc., which is feeding inflation. So, we've got basically, one arm of the government, or well, I should say the government, pulling in one direction, and then you've got the central bank trying to curb it, doing the opposite, and that's creating this sort of burnout economy where you got the economy going at cross purposes. So, I think until they resolve that situation, well, we're going to keep having, ineffective and poor outcomes.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, CBA, I think, when they were giving evidence last week in front of Parliament, said that only about 60% of the rate rises have really worked through the economy, so they think there's more coming. But the most interesting thing was a stunning chart showing that by age band, the relative spend has changed dramatically. If you're younger, you're spending less than you were a year ago, whereas on the other side, you're spending more. So you've got a differential impact of all of these things that are happening, but it's only squeezing a relatively small proportion of the total footprint. And that's why we've still got a lot of people who are spending quite freely and why the retail's not looking too bad. So it's another classic example, to use Tarek's analogy of pulling in two directions at the same time. But the impact is not universally spread across everybody. It's hitting a relatively small proportion, those with a mortgage and those in the rental sector, and those people are, of course, being smashed.
100%. Now, I've actually got the chart in front of me, would you believe? Okay, cool. So everyone ignore the writing around here. Basically, this is the chart that Marnus just mentioned from Commonwealth Bank. And basically what it shows is that, so what they did is they've measured spending by age group in the year to March 2022 using the ABS data. And what it shows is basically that anyone who's under the age of 55 has effectively cut their spending by more than the rate of inflation. So they've basically done a real spending cut. Whereas anyone over 55 is actually spending at a higher rate than inflation. And if you look at the group, the 25 to 29-year-olds, they've basically had zero spending growth in the year to March. Whereas the oldest cohorts, the 75 plus, have increased their spending at almost double the rate of inflation. So 13% versus a 7% inflation rate. And the reason for this is, like I mentioned before, the interest rate rises are only impacting, say, a third of households, and they're the ones with mortgages who tend to be younger. At the same time, we've got soaring rental costs, which is obviously impacting younger people more because they're the ones who tend to rent more, whereas the older owner-occupying cohorts who've paid off their mortgages mostly and obviously aren't impacted by interest rate rises or rents are basically spending like drunken sailors. And what that's effectively doing is that is basically increasing spending across the economy, and it's causing it's basically prompting the RBA to lift rates higher than it otherwise would. And this sort of gets to the inefficient nature of it. You're smashing the 1/3, you've got mortgages, whereas the other, you got 1/3 who are renting who are getting smashed by rising rents. You got 1/3 who are mortgage holders who are getting smashed, and then you got 1/3 effectively, roughly, of households who mostly older people, mostly own their own homes outright, who aren't affected. And in fact, a lot of them actually getting richer because their deposit rates have obviously gone up with their interest rate rise. They tend to own a high share of investment properties, a lot of those without leverage, so they're getting the massive rise in rents, so they're creaming it there. And even if you're one of the poorer older cohorts who's on the age pension, your pension's at least going up by the inflation rate, whereas workers on average, they're seeing their real wages fall because their wages are going up at half the rate of inflation. So we've got this kind of intergenerational problem at the moment whereby, one segment of society, predominantly older, over 55s are doing well, and the rest are, struggling.
Absolutely. You might want to end your screen
sharing.
I'm glad
it worked.
Yeah, no, it works. And feel free to do it again if you'd like to. And this is the interesting observation because, of course, central banks around the world are using their blunt instrument, which is effectively interest rates. And quite clearly, the interest rate lever isn't hitting everybody equally. And yet it's the policy that they've got. It's the models that they use. It's also a question of, I suppose, what you should be measuring in terms of, how do you measure the success of an economy? Now, of course, Chalmers has got, is it 50 in his new metric set? Everything from the color of the sky and how green is the grass.
Okay, this is the biggest load of BS I've ever seen. So basically, my partner in crime, Dave Llewellyn Smith's called the woke domestic product. is what he labelled it. So what Chalmers wants to do is basically set up this wellbeing framework. Now, it sounds great. In theory, it makes sense, I suppose. And what this will do is this will effectively, in a couple of months, he wants to launch this Wellbeing Index, which is going to have 50 indicators of Australia, not necessarily economic or whatever, to map the progress of living standards, I guess, or progress of Australians. Now, that sounds great in theory. The problem is, what are the indicators? And you can bet your bottom dollar that it's going to be set up in a way to make the government look good, and set up in a way that will basically hide Australia's, failing economic performance. We've got real wages tanking, we've got per capita recession, basically, incoming. And obviously, we've got the rental market in stress, got infrastructure getting crush loaded, state governments are all, drowning in debt, trying to keep up with population growth, etc. And I can bet your bottom to those 50 indicators will not view the federal government's mass immigration program, unprecedented immigration, as being negative. Now, if it was a serious wellbeing indicator, it include things like access to hospitals, congestion on roads, access to public transport, access to parks, all that sort of stuff. And every one of those measures, and obviously access to housing, like the quality of housing, the size of housing, the housing in relation to jobs, all that sort of stuff. Pretty much all those indicators are made worse by his immigration program. So you can bet your bottom dollar he's not going to include stuff. He's going to basically juke the stats to make it so that he can manipulate it and talk and show that we're having this great progress when really everyone knows we're not improving. It's as plain as day. And what I'd actually like to see him do is, instead of doing all this BS, just elevate GDP per capita as the central economic figure that we look at. It's already reported by the national accounts every quarter, by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. But unfortunately, the way it's all done at the moment, the media, economists, the government, everyone focuses on the headline GDP number. So basically, if the Australian economy grows, that's considered good. Doesn't matter how we grow. And the fact of the matter is, the way we've been growing is just by pump priming, people. So basically, we've been running population, quantitative peopling. So other economies have used quantitative easing, like money printing, to juice growth. In Australia, in Canada as well, and New Zealand, we all use quantitative peopling. So we just bring in tons of people and we grow the pie through inputs in people. And they obviously consume and whatever, and we've got to build houses for them. That grows the pie. The problem with it is everyone's slice of the pie has not been improving. It's been getting worse. For the past nearly 2 decades, have been running this ridiculous program. And all we need to do, if you really wanted to do a well-being type focus, just elevate per capita GDP as a central figure. So when you get the national accounts every quarter, the ABS goes, Australia's per capita GDP grew by whatever. And then the media reports that as the figure. The governments look at per capita GDP as the figure. It's not a perfect figure, don't get me wrong, but it's simple. And what it will do is it'll expose this, population Ponzi economics that federal governments have used for the past nearly 20 years. But because it will do that is the reason why they won't do it, because they don't want this shell game that they've been running to be exposed. Because if they were to use per capita GDP, people would look at it and go, shit, per capita GDP growth has been falling for decades since it's been running this high immigration program. Living standards haven't been improved. Why are we doing this? So that's why they always report, obviously, headline GDP, because they can say rubbish stuff like, before the pandemic hit, Australia had the longest continuous run without a recession. Well, yeah, if you measure in per capita terms, we didn't, because we just primed a whole bunch of people in here. The economy kept growing and we avoided recession that way, even though we had numerous periods where everyone sliced the economic pie, actually got smaller. And it's getting smaller right now. But the way, unfortunately, with the population growth run at 2%, Australia's economy's got to effectively go backwards by 2% for us actually to have a headline recession. Even though at the moment, per capita GDP is falling and is projected to fall for the next 2 years. So, forget this woke domestic product thing, Jim. Just make per capita GDP the measure, mate. Simple. It's already been done. And, it tells us enough to give us an indicator of how the economy's going in per person terms, which is really what matters. It's not perfect, but it's, hell of a lot better than what we've got, and it's simple. And there isn't a whole lot of room to basically juke the stats, which is what he wants to do with this wellbeing framework. Again, he's going to put a whole bunch of indicators in there to basically muddy the waters so that you can't actually get a read on what's really going on. And then, of course, with 50 indicators, he can pick the 10 that suits his narrative and ignore the rest, and talk about those. And then when they turn pear-shaped, he can flick to another 10 over here and whatever. It's just a whole thing to basically obfuscate and confuse people. And I think that's the whole purpose of it. And it's obviously there to sound, virtue signal, to basically sound like he's doing something, which is the modus operandi of this government. Basically, pretty much everything they do is, or everything they've done so far has all been about looking good and sounding like you're doing stuff without actually doing stuff. And in many cases, making the situation worse. So unfortunately, that's the reason why I dislike this government with a passion, but also dislike the previous one. So it's nothing unusual for me.
But they both do the same sort of thing, right? Which is basically, as you say, virtual signalling, and then not doing the real things that they should be tackling. Not tackling some of the really fundamental structural issues that should have been tackled a long time ago, and fiddle around the edges. But I'd also say that I think that both the mainstream media and a lot of the economists that are out there are part of the problem, because they just sort of get fed and parrot back all of this quote good news, right, and whatever it is. There's very little critique that goes on anywhere, and I guess I'm conscious of that in the context of the Reserve Bank governor now going to actually be in front of a press conference. That's going to make a difference, isn't it, in terms of the depth and penetration of queries from the mainstream media?
Oh, absolutely, mate. Look. Unfortunately, most economists are paid shills. Let's face it. So, most either work in a government type role where you basically toe the company line, which is I did that when I worked there. You often don't know any better, to be honest with you. You're kind of indoctrinated. You get stuck in this group thing. That's just the way it is. And then if you do go to the private sector, well, you're most of the time working for, say, an industry group or some other pseudo lobby group, or you're in a think tank where you're basically funded by industry, for example, the Grattan Institute. So there are very few actual, genuine, independent economists out there who will actually tell the truth. And most of them really are just, pushing a company line, pushing a vested interest, because that's who pays their bills. And that's the unfortunate reality that I'd view most with skepticism. And there's nothing worse than an economist at one of those press conferences just basically, feeding, basically just feeding platitudes to political leaders or RBA governor or whatever. Like they really ask the hard question, because they're worried if they do, they lose their access, or they won't be invited back, or or they're just gutless. So it's a reason why someone like me will never be invited to one of those sort of conferences. I'll be blacklisted because I'm a loose cannon. So they don't like loose cannons.
No, well, indeed. When you say loose cannons, it means asking the harder questions that nobody else wants to touch, right? Because that's part of the issue. And in fact, there was a couple of questions. One of them was relating specifically to this disinformation bill, which is in draft form. And there's concerns about that, because it might be harder to have some of these conversations on this channel, and some of the comments would be potentially not appearing because the mainstream media and, of course, the YouTubes and everything else will be turning down the volume on stuff that isn't government endorsed. So that's a real problem, because it basically means you have less opportunity to debate these real critical issues. And what I don't really get, well, I sort of do and don't, that there is a very narrow group of people who really want to have a real discussion about some of the real issues. Almost everybody else, it just seems to be happy to hunker down and say, well, it is what it is, and let's carry on, which is shameful, because ultimately bad decision on bad decision cascade over the years, and you end up with an economy like we've got, where if you take housing as an example, housing is way overpriced relative to income. The banks are over leveraged to property. Their mortgage books are going to be shot to pieces if property prices fall. Therefore, property prices have to be supported, and therefore we've got this situation where, despite ultra low levels of consumer confidence, despite rising interest rates, guess what? probably still going the other way. So it shows you that you end up in a situation where, there are huge issues that actually nobody really wants to touch.
Yeah, that's right. And look, in some ways, I don't blame less necessarily individuals, because I guess, I mean, I'd probably be the same if this wasn't my job. I probably would switch off a bit as well, because you just you get used to basically being, I guess, it sounds a bit negative, but beaten down, I suppose. If you're constantly fed this BS, and then you can sort of push back at it for a while and whatever, but after a while you're just like, whatever. And then I think people just lose interest, and they go, I can't be bothered anymore. I'll just do my, I'll just won't worry about it. I'll just look after me, etc. But certainly, a lot of the message nowadays, it's all a lot of it's just propaganda. It's it's just virtue signaling. It's pretending to do stuff rather than actually doing it. And that's kind of we see it all over. Like some examples with the current government in Australia. We've got this BS Housing Australia Future Fund. This so-called 30,000, this fund that's going to help build 30,000 homes, social homes, over 5 years. Well, 30,000 homes over 5 years on a projected population increase of 2.18 million, according to the budget, is absolute drop in the bucket. And when you actually look at its $500 million a year spend that's going to have, supposedly, assuming it makes the returns in the investment markets, to build the 6,000 homes a year, it's about $84,000 a home. Now, what can you buy for $84,000 a home? It just shows you that it's it's completely inadequate, and it's all about having an announceable. Albanese can get up there going, look, we're doing something about the homeless crisis. We're doing something about the rental crisis. I've got this Housing Australia Future Fund, which the opposition and the Greens are blocking. Blah, blah, blah. You can point to that. I'd argue the Voice is a whole lot of, noise over substance as well. But it's something else they can distract us with. The whole government is run around distractions and just sort of pretending to do stuff that rather than actually, doing stuff that matters. And, I don't think it's going to change. I think it's just the way it is. It's all about branding. Like everyone talked about Scotty for marketing when the Liberal Party was in. The coalition was in last term. Well, we've got Albo for marketing. It's no different. It's just that everyone, Scott Morrison was basically just came across as more shifty, whereas Albo's shifty in his own way, but he's just got a more of a smiling face. So he'll sort of knife you in the back smiling. Whereas Morrison was basically he wasn't as good a liar, I guess. But Scotty for marketing, Albo for marketing, it's all the same spin. They all do the same stuff. Doesn't matter who's in, Liberal or Labor, Pepsi, Coke, same diff. And it's just amazing how after doing this for sort of 12 years, it's like every year is pretty much the same, and nothing ever changes. It's just the same BS over and over again, unfortunately. So, but what do? Just write about it, and now I've sort of got the stage where I laugh at it. So I used to get really angry about it. Now I'm just like, I don't get angry anymore. I just kind of, well, sometimes I do, but most of the time I'm just like, it almost feels like I'm writing satire on Macrobusiness. We write about this stuff. So, it's the way it is. I'm sure you feel the same way, Martin.
I do, absolutely. And in fact, Yes, Minister is one of the most important documentary series about the way that government works, in my view, from years ago, right?
Mate, nothing's changed.
No, exactly right. And this whole idea of misdirection, right? So, if you're a magician and you want to do something sleight of hand, what you do is you point somebody over there and they look over there and you do it over here, right? And there's a lot of misdirection going on. So, you got bright, shiny things that you distract people with, and I think The Voice is one of those. The problem is that it's not actually tackling the real critical fundamental issues, which is about what is the future of Australia. How is the economy going to actually thrive and survive into the future? Because at the moment, they're not actually dealing with the critical policy issues that need to be. And by the way, it's not just Australia. You could say the same in the UK, probably in spades as well. And pretty much everywhere in Western economies, there's something fundamentally flawed about a lot of these Western economies, nobody wants to tackle the real burning issues that should be tackled, and everybody's just saying, "Oh well, we'll just muddle through and get re-elected, and then that's all." And it almost seems to me that the answer is they're only interested in getting re-elected because re-election is about what they're up to. That's all they're after. So the rest of it, forget it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing basically what's interesting at the moment is we've got this unified push, whether it's Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK. All the governments are trying to basically ramp immigration to, this is just one example of how to, this sort of quantitative peopling approach, whereby they've kind of used the quantitative easing already, and they've kind of used that, shot that bullet. Because interest rates have risen and all that sort of stuff. So now they're reaching for. Australia's been doing it for a long time, but the four countries in unison are basically reaching for this quantitative peopling new economic growth driver, which is basically just getting as many people as you can to solve fake skills shortages and solve an aging population, which it doesn't do anyway, doesn't work, as a way to basically expand each country's GDP, but obviously while per capita outcomes are terrible, and it's just this way to sort of give this illusion of growth. And they did it, last decade or until last couple of years with cheap money, but now that sort of avenue's exhausted itself. They're now doing it with quantitative peopling. So it's just the latest. It's kind of it's sort of like what you do when you've run out of ideas or you can't be bothered really. The easiest way is just to go for the cheap and lazy growth, and that's just like in this case, in Australia's case, for a long time, it's just been bring in tons of people, and then build houses and sell coffees to them, and get the old GDP widgets spinning, and keep growing the economy, even though actual living standards and per capita the per capita economies perform very poorly. And but it is very interesting watching all four countries do it at the same time. All four countries have got basically rental crises at the moment. So they're all doing it into this, and they've all got stunted housing supply because of the pandemic. Construction costs are going up, and we've got it's not just Australia where obviously a lot of builders are going broke. It's happened in a couple of other countries as well. So each of these places has got sort of stunted housing supply at the same time as they're all running extreme immigration programs and just making their housing situations even worse. So it's quite ridiculous, and in the end, it's going to hurt the youngest Australians the most, the ones who aren't already in on the treadmill, and sadly, they're also the ones who tend to be the most distracted by these kind of policies and these virtue signaling by the government. So they're the ones getting conned the most, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the big con, the long con, right? And it's actually got to the point where many people just assume that this is the way the economy has to be because this is the way the economy has to be. So there's very little, real questioning. Now, Donna,
it's
actually,
also all they've known.
Yeah,
it's also all they've known. I mean, if you're someone who's grown up in this environment, that's all you've ever seen. So
yep.
You don't really know any different. And so yeah, I don't. Again, I don't really blame individuals for putting up with it because that's just what they know, and they're the sort of rules of the game. They're like, oh, okay, that's the way it is. Like, if I was a young person and I knew what I knew and what I know, and I was locked out of the housing market, I'd be furious. If I was like forced to rent in these insecure rentals, and you're like basically, you got these crappy insecure jobs, and you really don't have much of a prospect if you're the average, say 20-year-old, for example, or 22-year-old. I'd be pretty angry about it. But I think I'm sure some of them are angry, but a lot of them probably just think, oh, that's the way it is. Like that's just the way it is. They don't realize that it wasn't the same for even when I was there at that age, or definitely when their parents were there. Like, we had a lot more opportunities, and they don't realize that their opportunities are basically getting stolen from them. So it's unfortunate, but it's the way it is, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Now, Donna asked a question a while ago, which I might just put it up there. Can you explain the per capita GDP, what it actually is, and if our population is 27 million, how much are we producing on an individual basis? And it's certainly gone backwards.
That's basically, Donna, that's exactly what you've just put in. So basically, if the Australian economy is $2 trillion and we've got we've got 26 million roughly at the moment. So if you, it's actually more than 2 trillion, but say, 2 trillion. You take the $2 trillion, you divide it by the population, and that's your per capita GDP. When I'm talking about per capita GDP should be the measure, it's more as a growth rate. So every time the national accounts comes out every quarter, for example, the last March quarter, it said Australia's economy grew 0.2% over the quarter. So we got growth. It's crappy growth, but we got growth. The problem is the population grew by 0.4%. So what it would have said is instead of, so when the ABS did their release and the headlines this and all the papers are saying, Australian economy grows 0.2% in quarter, it would have said, Australia's per capita growth falls 2% in the March quarter. And they should just basically make that the statistic that matters, because it's not the size of the pie that matters, it's the share of the pie that matters. Now, again, this is, per capita GDP isn't a perfect measure. It's certainly not. There's a lot of stuff GDP doesn't measure. It doesn't measure distribution. So obviously, if the pie is growing, but you've got the 10% of the population getting 90% of it, well, that's not exactly great from society. So it doesn't measure distribution. GDP doesn't measure a whole bunch of things. So for example, if I live in a decent house, if I was to knock this house down, the demolition of it adds to GDP. If I was to replace it with a house that's even worse than the current house I live in, that building of that new house adds to GDP. So at the start, I was in a house of, say it's an 8 out of 10 house. And then I knock it down and then rebuild a 7 out of 10 house. I've actually got a worse endpoint, but you've got 2 sets of GDP produced out of that. You've got a GDP in the demolition and you've got GDP in the building of the new house. So that's giving you growth, but you're actually no better off at the end. And it's the same when, when Australia digs up a whole bunch of resources and sells it overseas, that counts as GDP, but there's no accounting for what's been lost. So for example, if we in the next year sold, say, all our gas resources, it's not possible, but you do it in a year. But if we did, we get a whole bunch of GDP in, but then you've used that asset, so it's all gone. So there's no accounting for what you lose. So it's not a perfect measure, but it is it's a simple measure. It's a lot better than just using aggregate GDP. And it gives you enough of a rule of thumb to sort of know if we're getting ahead on an individual basis or not. And at the moment, we're not. And if you use the Bank for International, the Standard & Poor's. So Standard & Poor's, S&P Global did a forecast on Australia's economy, and they tipped 1.4% growth this year, 1.2% next year. But our population is, according to the Australian Treasury, the latest budget, is going to grow by 2% this year and about 1.7% next year. So that's two full calendar years where Australia's economy is going to shrink in per capita terms. But you won't read about it. You won't read they're going to have this 2-year recession. All you're going to hear is that, Australia's economy grew by 1.4% and then 1.2%. So we still got growth. And this is how Australia has basically avoided a recession for so long, apart from the pandemic, that short dip in the pandemic, because we've had this strong population growth, world-leading population growth. Actually, we're not world-leading at the moment. Canada's actually beaten us, but by Canada's population growth, immigration is extreme at the moment. But over the last 20 years, Australia's pretty much been on top. And this is what we've done. That's true, Will. It is. Look, it's not a perfect measure, but it's better than what we use. And it's good enough for a quick and dirty indicator per capita GDP. And the whole thing is, when we're looking at economic statistics, we've got to work within the confines of what we've got. So, if GDP, if the national accounts is produced one way, and this is globally recognised, and the whole world sort of produces the same set of accounts, which we do, because it's kind of it's globally standardised. You can't expect to then create this whole new measure that no one else uses, because no one's going to look at it. But what you can do is, when the national accounts comes out and it comes out with all the usual figures, you can elevate that one figure to the headline. And by doing that, you'll see through all this BS, all this, this sort of rubbish quantitative peopling that the federal government has run for nearly 20 years, where it's juiced the economy just by bringing a whole bunch of people in here and let's face it, it's been worse for the environment. It's wrecked living standards. I'm not against immigration. I'm just against super turbocharged, strong immigration like we've had. and it has eroded the quality of life. So it's like, well, if we're doing that just purely to grow the economy and they give this illusion of growth, what's the point? Why are we doing it? And at least if you focus on the per capita GDP, it'll remove that population people, the quantitative people in effect, which is why I think that's what the government should do, but it won't, because it'll obviously highlight their own failures. So I'm just waxing lyrical and hoping or wishing, I should say, wishful thinking.
Yeah, hope isn't a strategy, but it's good to at least shine the spotlight on this first, and that's why this is an important conversation. Another important conversation was the consumer confidence. Right, this is the Roy Morgan that came out today, and well, it's really, really, really grinding down to levels that we only just briefly saw through the COVID lockdown. So this, for me, is a very important indicator, and you could argue whether it's accurate, but actually it's quite interesting. If you look at it then by different cohorts, it's an even worse position, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Now I'm just trying to find the so I've just lost you for a second, so I want to share my screen now. That I'll tell you what, mate, you've actually created a monster here. Because I've now just learned how to do this. I'll just double check that you haven't got the same one. All right, so this is ANZ's breakdown by cohort. So what they actually show, they've actually broken consumer confidence, weekly consumer confidence going back all the way to 2014 by cohort. So as you can see, those paying off the home, consumer confidence is lowest amongst them, as you'd expect with mortgage rates. But check out the collapse there. So, what's that, 5 years ago, you had confidence at this level about 130. Now this is an index, so it's just 130 is meaningless. But if you look at the fact that it's almost halved since 2018, or even, it's collapsed in the last year or so. Also, those who are renting, which is shown in yellow, is also according to Roy Morgan's and ANZ, is at an all-time record low. So obviously renters, this kind of gets to my point. Renters are getting smashed. Mortgage holders are getting smashed. Those who own the home have also had a pretty big fall, but it's not as bad. So it's this sort of three Australias we've got at the moment: the renters, the mortgage holders, and then the rest. Although I would argue in this case they're all pretty bad. But yeah, it does give you a pretty interesting idea about where the pain's been felt. It's been felt more by renters and especially mortgage holders who've obviously bearing the brunt of this cost of living crisis and interest rate rises.
Absolutely. Well, of course, I publish my monthly mortgage and rental stress numbers, and the rental stress went up. 68% of those in rental accommodation are now having cash flow issues. The mortgage holders a bit lower, about 48%, but still very high. But then if you actually drill it down and say, well, what are the types of people who are actually in the most pressure, then you find this same issue about younger cohorts, first-time buyers and those sorts of things, younger people who are renting. And the other observation, which the ABS reported, was that more people are working more jobs to try and get by.
Yep.
So we're seeing
job holders,
proliferation of part-time jobs, or working over the weekend or whatever to try and get by. So the pressures are really on a lot of these particular households, and yet home prices are still, according to CoreLogic, continuing to recover from their falls, and the banks are extending mortgages for a longer period and moving into interest only, so they're extending and pretending. So there's a lot of levers being pulled, plus of course the government incentive schemes as well, to try and keep the property price model up rather than down, when it's out of kilter with everything else. So once again, this fundamental policy question comes to the fore. Why is it that we're actually in this situation? And that goes right back to what you've been saying. It's because nobody wants to tackle this fundamentally critical issue.
Yeah, and also, obviously having coaxed in a whole bunch of people, massive numbers of first home buyers with ultra cheap rates before the 2020, 2021, and the start of 2022. Obviously, you've got to, you don't want to throw those people to the wolves by letting the housing market crash. So, yeah, it's a whole bunch of, it's just policy failure left, right, and centre. Let's face it. And obviously, the population growing by 500,000 people last calendar year didn't help. we had nearly 400,000 net overseas migrants last year. Admittedly, most of them go into the rental market when they start, but which is the main reason why we're seeing rents go up at such a huge pace. But what I think we're getting is we're getting a lot of, I guess, induced FOMO in a way. So we've got low listing numbers at the moment. We've got obviously record numbers of people piling in. Rental vacancy rates near record lows. We've got double-digit rent increases. And effectively, people are just basically saying, bugger it, I'm going to borrow everything I can to get out of this rental treadmill because, you know, it's really hard to even find a home and get one. And then you obviously get absolutely butchered with double-digit rent rises. And I think a lot of people are now just basically, you know, borrowing to the hilt, basically just trying to get out of the rental treadmill and to buy. And that's just, has helped to put a floor under prices alongside really low listings levels. I still think it'd be interesting though. We've still got, by my calculations, probably about 450,000 fixed rate mortgages that are going to expire the remainder of this year. So, you know, we've still got a lot of people that are going to come off sort of 2% fixed rates to variable rates of 6.5% plus. So it'd be interesting to see what happens. There has been some anecdotal reports of forced selling, or, you know, maybe not forced as in the bank's going to foreclose on you, but people being basically coming to the realization that they can't really afford to keep their house, so they're starting to sell. And we are seeing with there's reportedly a lot of property investors leaving. So, you know, apparently a quarter of the homes, I think a third of homes in Sydney, if you believe, I think CoreLogic, third of homes that are selling at the moment are being sold by investors. So we have a lot of investors now selling up because even though rents are rising, they're obviously, you know, heavily negatively geared and they're like, bugger this, it's too hard. So they're selling. There has been a lot of, bluster in the media about this doom and gloom about investors selling, therefore the rental crisis is going to get worse, which is a complete load of baloney. For the simple reason, if an investor sells, the property doesn't disappear. They either sell to another investor or they sell to an owner-occupier or, you know, first home buyer. So when an investor sells it basically to an owner-occupier, it does reduce rental supply by one, but also reduces rental demand by one because a renter becomes a homeowner. So I don't know if you've seen those sorts of reports, Martin. There's a lot of fear-mongering about that, about property investors are leaving, therefore the rental crisis is going to get worse. Now that would be true if they weren't buying off the plans, but as we know, the overall majority of investors buy established dwellings. So really, if anything, investors leaving is actually good for first home buyers. There's the correlation between investor mortgage commitments and first home buyer mortgage commitments is almost perfectly negatively correlated. So when investors buy less, first home buyers buy more, and vice versa. So it is an interesting situation at the moment in the property market. As I said, I think a couple episodes ago with you, I never would have picked that we'd have prices increasing with rates rising. But here we are. And it's also very unusual, not only the fact that rates are rising, but it's also very unusual to get prices rising off falling volumes. Usually you need two conditions for prices to rise. You need rates to be falling, and you also need volumes to be rising. That's sort of a normal bull cycle in the property market. But we've actually got the opposite of that. We've got rates rising and sales volumes falling. So it's a really thin market, and yet property values are rising. It's the strangest market I think I've ever seen. What's going on in the UK? Is it a similar situation over there?
Yeah, pretty similar. So there's quote lack of supply, although actually if you look carefully, Airbnb is a big problem over here too, particularly in some of the more attractive areas around the coast. In some places, 50 or 60% of properties in certain locations are Airbnb. So they're actually vacant for quite a lot of the time and then effectively are Airbnb. There is not enough new stuff, affordable stuff being built because exactly the same issues. Planning they blame planning restrictions, they blame failure of builders, etc. But that's sort of a bit of a subtext. But the most critical thing is, just as in Australia, the banks have been lending big, not quite as big as in Australia. They've had more constraints put on them in terms of income multiples. So anything above 5 times is difficult, whereas in Australia, 8 times or 9 times has been perfectly fine until now. But we are now seeing considerable reports of people distressed selling, people unable to make their mortgage repayments. The banks are trying to be accommodative. In fact, they've just put a code in place between the banks and the government to try and ensure that banks don't push people out too quickly, and they give them a chance to restructure their mortgage, etc., etc. But that's smoke and mirrors, really. It doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. So it's like you could replace pretty much every element that you see in Australia in the UK, and you've got precisely the same dynamics going on, except that if you look at the debt to income ratios or the proportion of lending that banks have made to the mortgage sector, Australia is way higher. I mean, just not a little higher, way higher. So Australia is way more extreme, right? Because we've had this 20 or 30 years of Ponzi in property. The banks, of course, here in the UK are saying, well, everything's fine. We're not seeing huge amounts of distressed sales and things, but they're doing a lot below the waterline to try and massage this. But the debt counsellors are so busy, they just don't know which way to turn. And so there was a report I saw the other day saying that debt counsellors are now are just unable to cope with the volume of people who are needing help. And in some cases, they're actually being tricked and trapped into doing dumb things to try and actually solve the problem, including short-term debt and all sorts of other things. So unfortunately, it's a very similar story, but in extremis in Australia.
So is my understanding is the UK is more fixed rate mortgages. I mean, even if they're shorter term.
Yeah, about 90 to 95% are fixed. That's very different from where in post the GFC, everybody went fixed because of the problem through GFC when rates went all over the place. So so that means there's a bit of a slow burn with regard to some of these resets, and that's why this is going to have a long term rather than a short term fit. And the typical reset at the moment is that people are going for 5 years. Because with the reversed or inverted yield curve, the longer term mortgages are cheaper than the shorter term ones.
Cheaper, yeah, that's interesting. So actually, New Zealand's very similar. So New Zealand, Westpac put out some data on New Zealand, and they've basically only had, I think they got another 150 basis points of tight. So even if the RBNZ keeps the rates the same and mortgage rates don't change, like fixed mortgage rates don't change. Basically, New Zealand borrowers are looking at another 150 basis points of effective rate hike. So the average effective mortgage rate, which is what households are actually paying, is going to rise by another 150 basis points into next year. And that's because New Zealand's got a lot higher share of fixed rates than Australia, but they're a bit like Australia. So Australia had over the just before the pandemic ended, before the RBA started hiking rates, we had about 25% of mortgages were fixed, which was like 40% were fixed, which is a record amount for that 2 years. New Zealand's is more like 80% are fixed. So they're more exposed to this fixed rate mortgage cliff than we are. And what it's done is, even though the RBNZ has hiked their cash rate to 5.5% versus ours at 4.1, we've actually had a lot more bite because we had a lot more variable rate mortgages, and they're going to start catching up over the next 6 months as all these fixed rate terms start to expire, because the RBNZ started hiking in August 2021, so they started a lot earlier than us. It's just interesting watching these different countries. They're all kind of headed on the same path. It's just that Australia, even though we haven't hiked rates as much, we're kind of earlier, because we have so much more exposure through variable rates, and we're obviously carrying higher debt loads. So it's interesting. And is what's the energy situation like in the UK? Have the prices come back down? I mean,
energy is really interesting because energy spiked dramatically. It went up about 5 times from the pre-energy crisis, but the government then intervened and gave people quite a considerable amount of support. So £400 on average, based on a typical household, for about a few months. Now that's coming off just as energy prices are coming down. So in fact, we are seeing energy prices falling in the UK. And so, for example, my monthly bill for electricity and gas was $375 when I first arrived here, and that was with the government support. It's now dropped to $280 a month, pounds that is. So it's falling. And in fact, the expectation is that it'll fall slightly more over the next quarter. And then unless there's another energy crisis through the winter. Luckily last year it wasn't particularly cold in the Northern Hemisphere, so the energy prices came back down quite quickly. Question will be, what happens if we have another spike? Will the government do the same again? I don't know. But at the moment, whereas in Australia you've got a rise of 20 to 30% for energy prices from 1 July, in the UK it's down 20 to 25% from where it was at its peak. So slightly different evolution in terms of the energy sector. But the other interesting observation there, the fact that you've got more variable rates in Australia gives the RBA a bit of wriggle room to explain why rates shouldn't go as high as in the UK or New Zealand, I suspect. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the cards that we see being played over the next couple of months.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, to be fair, I mean, I think it should all be data driven. So, if for example the next labour market report on I think it's Thursday is comes in soft, then we get a run of soft data and lots of stuff. Well, I mean they really should hold. I mean my opinion is they should hold anyway, and then just because we've got this fixed rate mortgage rollover. So as you said before, CBA reckons only 60% of the rate hikes have been passed on. As yet, because obviously there's a lag between when the RBA sets rates and when they actually hit mortgage holders. But the bigger thing is the fixed rate mortgage reset, which is going to pretty much run throughout the rest of this year. And the next year it kind of almost normalizes, where you get sort of normal amounts of mortgages rolling over. But the next 6 months are going to have quite a lot of monetary tightening anyway, just because of this fixed rate mortgage reset. So it's going to get tougher anyway, even if the RBA does nothing. So it would probably be a mistake if they kept hiking when the data's already pretty soft, or it's softening now. I don't know if you saw the SEEK employment data that came out earlier this week. It showed that obviously that the job ads have been falling. They've been falling pretty much for a year now. But the bigger, more interesting indicator there was that actually showed that the number of applications per job is actually above what it was pre-pandemic, or basically in line with what it was pre-pandemic. So it already shows that the sort of labour market's already at the same amount of tightness as it was before COVID hit. Because obviously we got big migration. We've had 500,000 workers arrive in the last year. Those people are looking for jobs. There's way more applicants per job, and what this means is that there's actually a pretty strong correlation between people per job, applications per job, and the unemployment rate. So what that's actually pointing to is that the unemployment rate's going to rise, and it could rise fairly significantly in the next sort of 6 months. So I think the RBA would be pretty crazy to hike into that, given that the monetary policy is already tightening anyway, because the fixed rate mortgage reset.
So what's your expectation in terms of the peak? Because the markets are saying 4.4, 4.5 as the peak, and then drifting down, but not really coming back down to where we currently are until, well, maybe December, not next year, but the year after.
Okay, I'll do this one. It's probably more accurate than my interest rate predictions. I've been wrong since this started. So, look, who knows, mate? Look, I mean, I think they should be done, but most of the banks, etc., think they got one more in them anyway. Actually, I think Westpac, CBA, I think they all think one more. There might be a couple outliers. I think two more. So we're probably close to the peak. I mean, we should be close to the peak. I think they should hold, but no one cares what I think. But yeah, I mean, I think we're certainly look. The timing's beautiful when you think about it. You got Michelle Bullock coming in October, so Governor Lowe's got two more interest rate meetings, so monetary meetings. If he's going to hike, you want to do it now. So basically, if they want to do two more hikes, they should do two more hikes now. And what that'll basically mean is that Michelle Bullock can come in. There'll be no more rate hikes under a watch, and then she'll start cutting rates whenever that is. I thought it was going to be towards late this year. Doesn't look very likely at the moment, but maybe first quarter next year they start cutting, because there'll be there'll be some sort of, I don't know, like the economy will slow enough that they'll have to start cutting. And then she can get the cheers because she'll be the governor who came in and started cutting interest rates, and there was no hikes under her watch. So I think optically and just logically, given we've got two more meetings from Phil Lowe, he can basically be the bad guy. He can play bad cop, do a couple more hikes. And then Michelle Bullock can play good cop. So if he goes too far, she can then cut, and then she'll be the hero for cutting. Rather than just holding at the moment. And then, there's still potential if you hold, and then the data, we do get to run a strong data, the last thing we'll do is her having to then hike rates as the new governor. So, technically it probably makes more sense for them to go harder, even if they don't need to, or they probably shouldn't. So that then when she comes in, she can be the hero and just cut. And then she'll get the cheers, and it'll sort of set her governorship off on a good wicket. That's kind of my read on tactically what will probably happen. Although I don't, I think from a pure policy perspective, I don't think they should raise rates anymore, just because this, the stuff I just said with the fixed rate mortgage reset and the tightening that's already built in, and the fact that we've got the labour market weakening, the economy, it's definitely soft. So, and consumer sentiment's terrible, business sentiment's terrible. All these sort of partial indicators are pretty bad. So I don't know if you want to really smash people anymore with, smash the 1/3 of people with mortgages even harder than you have. But, tactically, outgoing governor, new governor coming in, you want to do the pain while the outgoing governor is still in.
Another reason why
that seems pretty logical.
Yeah, another reason, of course, is that cost of government debt is continuing to rise at the moment. And my suspicion is that Chalmers will want to see that go in a slightly different direction ahead, because, of course, at the moment the debt servicing obligations that they have will get higher and higher. So seeing rates come down sooner rather than later would be quite useful for them from a political perspective as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make, actually, because I live in the broke state of Victoria, almost soon to become the failed state of Victoria. But New South Wales is a similar story, not quite as bad, but you got the two biggest states, which are obviously got the strongest population growth for immigration, and the federal government's piling in the people. Like, just at the moment, Sydney and Melbourne particularly are getting absolutely stuffed, crush loaded at the moment with population growth. And you've got both state governments are basically drowning in debt. Victoria worse than New South Wales. It's got a little bit to do with COVID, but most of it, like 80% of it in Victoria's case, is because both governments have done massive infrastructure builds, and they've all been poorly targeted. I'd argue Victoria's is way worse than New South Wales. But basically, it gets down to this thing that I said last time, I think I was on, is that in order to keep pace with this huge population growth, you need to undertake these massively expensive infrastructure projects. So infrastructure costs so much more than it used to, let alone the fact that materials cost more and labour and all that sort of stuff. It's the fact that if you need to build a new road now, and both cities are already built out, you got to basically do tunnelling. And tunnelling is incredibly expensive. Or if you want to build, say, a new metro train line, you've got to do tunnelling as well as build stations. And then that requires, buying some of the most expensive land in the world above ground, during the building process, or to locate those stations there. So, both New South Wales and Victoria have been trying to keep up with this rampant population growth we've had for, 15, nearly 20 years. And that basically they failed to do it. But at the same time, both governments have gotten into huge amounts of debt to try and do it. They've tried to get around that by then flogging off everything that's not bolted down, and also sort of these, other non-physical assets like your land registries and all this sort of stuff. And, there was talk about in New South Wales, the Perrottet government, the previous government, wanted to privatise Sydney Water. There was a bit of news about that. So they're basically trying to sell off anything they can to try and get quick money in, basically go down to cash converters, pawn your goods, get some quick cash, which then leaves you poorer because you stop getting the income from those assets going forward. And, they're basically getting poorer and poorer. And we've just seen today, the Victorian government, after stupidly agreeing to host the Commonwealth Games, which they hosted in 2006, and it was Commonwealth Games is a joke. The Victorian government then, agreed to host it again in 2026. Well, now they've realised, oh, hang on, that's got a $6 billion cost attached to it. We can't afford it. So now they've cancelled the Commonwealth Games. And we're actually seeing governments across both New South Wales and Victoria, despite the fact they've got record numbers of people in, now starting to cancel infrastructure projects because they can't afford. They're basically stranded in debt and they can't afford them. And there's also obviously constraints on materials and labour and all this stuff. There's not enough capacity in the economy to build them right now and to keep up with the population. So it's creating this headache. They're drowning in debt. It also means that basically if you're a resident of Sydney and Victoria and Melbourne at the moment, you're basically looking at your living standards getting completely crush loaded because the population's going up. The federal budget predicts that Victoria's population is going to grow by about 500 million people. 500,000 people over the next 5 years. So Victoria's nearly 700,000, but if you look at Melbourne's historical share, it's going to grow by about 500,000. Sydney will grow by about 450 over the next 5 years. So Sydney's going to grow by Canberra. Melbourne's going to grow by more than a Canberra. And the governments are basically being forced to cut back on infrastructure spending because they can't afford it. So all that means is that everything's going to get more congested. And it's going to basically be crappier if you're a resident of these two cities to try and get around because you got more people trying to use the existing infrastructure. And this is often infrastructure base that hasn't kept up for 20 years. We're falling further and further behind every year because we never caught up. And it's just going to get even worse. And Victoria is really got shades of what happened in the late 80s and early 90s under the Kane government, where he basically ran Victoria into the ground. And then Kennett had to come in and, try and fix things. We had a pretty deep recession down here and et cetera. And I think we're just going to repeat the same BS all over again, where the government is just basically, it's almost become a failed state. And I wonder how long until Dan Andrews does a Jacinda Ardern and just says, well, hang on, I'm done, I'm leaving, and just passes the torch to someone else and lets them cop the flack, similar to what Victoria did in the late 80s when John Cain did a similar sort of thing, and then he passed the torch to Jane Kerner, and then, she basically led a dying government for a few years. So, it's pretty... that point you made about state government debt is pertinent because it's really coming home to roost in Victoria, but also New South Wales, but more Victoria at the moment.
Absolutely. Well, if you do the quick calculations, if you look at the state debt and the federal debt, the share of the tax take that is being pushed towards servicing debt is continuing to rise, and that means you've got less to do other things. So you've got to either trim your cloth, or you've got to put taxes up, or you've got to increase the GST, or do something, right, to try and square the circle. And I guess the only sort of corollary of that is that if you do continue high levels of migration and they're working, then you actually increase the tax base. And of course, the other thing that they're doing is not allowing the tax bands to lift. So effectively, by definition, bracket creep is actually the biggest source. And if you look at the last Treasury report, it was bracket creep and some better than expected prices of commodities that actually saved the day. But of the two, the bracket creep was most significant.
Oh, absolutely, and obviously we've got turbocharged bracket creep at the moment because we've got high inflation. So we've got high inflation. We've got wage growth's not high, like it's falling in real terms, but it's higher than it's been in the last 10 years. And so people are moving up the tax scales quick. And obviously the government's not adjusting those. The one thing, so basically, as you said, I think it's about 3/4 of the increase in the improvement in the federal budget the last federal budget was actually from increasing income taxes. Now, it wasn't just bracket creep, it was also mass immigration. So, we had a 500,000 roughly expansion in the labour force over the year because mostly through immigration. And then you also had the bracket creep on top. So you basically had more workers to get taxes from. Then you also had, obviously, each worker paying higher taxes because this bracket creep means a lot of money for the federal government. Now, the problem with it is, and I've said this previously on other shows, is that the way the tax revenues are distributed in Australia is completely inequitable. So the feds collect about 80%, actually 82%, if you want to be technical, but around 80% of the nation's tax revenues, and the states and local governments collect 20%, most of the states. And we've got this situation where the feds love big Australia immigration because they basically get all the benefits through tax receipts, but most of the costs are actually borne by the state government, because the state governments are the ones who are responsible mostly for infrastructure, service delivery, schools and hospitals, all that sort of stuff. So most of the stuff that people actually use, who live in Sydney, Melbourne, etc., comes from the state government. But they're the ones who are cash starved, because the feds run these huge immigration programs. They come to Sydney and Melbourne. State governments have got to provide for them. They're broke. They can't afford to. So they privatise everything they can to try and build infrastructure. They never build enough, so our living standards get degraded. But then the federal government goes, "Oh, look, this is great. Migration's fantastic. It's it provides us all this tax revenue. But they don't look at the costs, because the costs are borne by other people, other areas of government, so state governments, and they're borne by us as individuals who are suddenly, if you're driving around Sydney now, 20 years ago, you could probably drive most roads without paying tolls. Now you can't drive anywhere. If you want to drive across the city now, you get Transurban reaching in your pocket, pulling out a 20 every time you want to drive anywhere, because they own, the entire toll road network pretty much. And that's, just one of the costs of this big Australia. We've brought in all these people. Sydney's grown by, nearly 1.5 million people in the last 20 years. They've had to build all these roads to try and keep up. They've all been done via toll roads. Transurban owns most of them. We've ended up with worse traffic congestion than we had 20 years ago, because they haven't kept up. But when you do drive, you end up getting fleeced to pay all these private tolls. And it's the same across, like energy networks and everything. Pretty much everything's been privatised now. So everyone's paying more than they used to, and the state governments end up being broker anyway, because they got the money up front, so they're better for a couple of years, but then they've lost that ongoing revenue stream. So they're actually, they've just gone in the cash converters, pawn their stuff, got some quick cash, but then they've been left having to rent that stuff back, effectively, or we as citizens have been have to rent it back off off private companies, and that's all made us worse off. So that's kind of the state of play, and a lot of it gets down to this unequal distribution between the feds and the states. I guarantee you, if the feds and the states had a more equal revenue share, the federal government wouldn't be so gung-ho in immigration, because suddenly it wouldn't just get the benefits, it wouldn't just get the revenue, it'd have to fund the costs as well. And if it had to do that, it probably would run a much smaller program, because it'd go, oh shit, hang on, every person we bring in here, that's an extra $100,000 of infrastructure we're going to build. It's actually more than that, but just say it's 100,000. And at the moment, they don't have to worry about that 100,000, because the buck goes somewhere else. It goes to the state government to then pawn it off to private companies and then fleece it with tolls, etc. So I honestly think the vertical fiscal imbalance between our governments is one of the central drivers of Australia's economic problems at a policy level. This situation where the feds collect most of the money, but they're not responsible for the service delivery of the infrastructure and stuff, causes a lot of problems. And if they're forced to internalize the costs of the things they do, and didn't just get the benefit of everything, of these immigration type things, we probably get more sustainable policy. But unfortunately, it's been this way since the Second World War, when the feds took over control of income taxes, and it's a historical accident, and it's not going to go back, unfortunately. So we're sort of stuck with the system we've got.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case, isn't it? And again, it goes back to, you don't want to disturb too much of the critical issues that should be attached. What you'll do is focus on the little fluffy things around the edge that you can distract people with, and keep those people coming in. That'll make the top line number look pretty good. So it sort of won't be quite so bad. But unfortunately, it's hitting real people, real businesses, particularly small businesses. I'm seeing a lot of small business going to the wall at the moment. I'm seeing a lot of households who are really struggling. So it's not actually creating either a very equal society, nor indeed a growth-led society, nor indeed a very productive society. So unfortunately, it's part of the story, I suppose, but not necessarily a good part of the story. And in fact, Jason threw this out, and you may not be able to read this. I'm sorry, I've got to fix this. I will when I get my full system up and running. But he says, cheers, Martin and Leith. Appreciate your thoughts and your time. I'm curious, given current path, where do you think Australia will be in 2 years with respect to interest rates, house prices, and energy prices? Leith, your thoughts?
I've actually got a pretty I think it's going to be fun. So I think actually, I reckon we're going to have another house price boom. So unfortunately, I mean, I can see the doomsday scenario where the the RBA cuts rates, right? So it's not going to cut back down to where it was through the pandemic, but it might shave 1.5% off the cash rate or something. So it might get down to 2.5% or something like that, maybe even 2% if the economy slows enough. And the government's still going to be running this, extreme immigration program. You're still going to have constrained supply because, I think dwelling approvals, the official forecast from the Treasury is dwelling construction is going to fall till 2025. And Oxford Economics actually predicted something similar. So we're going to have this, fall in housing supply in new builds at the same time as this immigration is just going to keep ramping. I don't think it's going to get stronger, but it's going to stay high. And so we're going to have this ongoing, rental squeeze, rental crisis, etc. So that's going to cause this sort of structural demand for housing. And then all we need is for the Reserve Bank to basically slash rates, which will increase borrowing capacity by a lot. So borrowing capacity shrunk by about a third since they've started hiking rates in May last year. And they might give, say, 15% of that back. Maybe not 15%, but probably about 15% of that borrowing capacity back. So borrowing capacity will rise. I wouldn't be surprised if, APRA lowers its mortgage buffer. So got a buffer of 3% currently above, mortgage rates. So I wouldn't be surprised if they cut it to 2% just to help the RBA out when they start to ease. So all that's going to happen is you're going to have the same forces that are putting pressure on the housing market with cheaper money and more borrowing capacity. So I just think that's red rag to bulls. So I wouldn't be surprised if we have another housing spurt. Maybe probably starting next year, assuming the RBA cuts interest rates. So in 2 years, I think house prices will probably be a fair bit higher, even if they do have a little dip over the next 6 months or something because of the fixed rate mortgage reset, which may happen. Energy prices, who the hell knows? I mean, I think energy prices will probably come down just because I think global prices will probably come down. So this is just me taking it apart. I've got no idea, really. But, assuming the Russia-Ukraine war, something happens there, like, there's some kind of solution. And, I think energy prices will probably ease from where they're at, but they're going to stay structurally higher than they were before Russia invaded Ukraine, unfortunately. So that's where I think. And I think this question came up while the RBA slashed rates. I just think they'll reverse some of the rate hikes they've done because the economy will weaken. And I think it's going to weaken, quite considerably in the next 12 months. We're going to have much higher unemployment just because we've got labour supply growing like a science experiment, and a slower economy equals higher unemployment. So, and the official forecast is basically for a per capita recession for 2 years. So I think once inflation does start to ease, so it already is easing with the supply side stuff, like the imported inflation is already starting to ease, and global energy is actually starting to ease. It's just that in Australia we're getting smashed. The problem we've got in Australia is the two pinch points are obviously got rents going up because of immigration, and we've got energy because we've just had the rise in the July 1 increase in energy costs. So that'll feed through for a bit, but that doesn't mean we're going to have another 25% increase in energy next year. So that'll wash through in the next 6 months, the energy cost, and then Inflation's measured on a rate of change. So just because it's gone up suddenly, it's got to go up again for it to create inflation the next year. So I think inflation will come down anyway. So if you got lower inflation and then you got obviously weakened economy and rising unemployment, I think the RBA is going to cut. But when, who knows? But the question was in 2 years' time. So it's like I think we could be pretty safe that there'll be some decent cuts within a 2-year period at some point over that 2-year period, which means house prices, and given immigration is going to is expected to stay strong for years, like it did pre-COVID, and Albanese government's signed all these migration pacts with India, which basically gives them easier access to come here. And let's face it, if you're living in India, you probably don't care if the Australian economy is weakened. It's still going to be a lot better than where you are. So you're going to come here anyway. So I think migration is going to stay strong, and that's basically going to keep lifting labour supply and lead to higher unemployment with a weak economy, and that'll keep putting upward pressure on house prices even without interest rates. So yeah, that's my view in 2 years' time.
Yeah, and it's just
lower interest rates, higher house prices, and probably lower energy costs because it'll normalise a bit.
And I would also add,
but who knows?
Productivity not improving, right? That's the other factor in all this.
No. I think Australia's productivity. Well, I think the advanced economy's productivity is shot. It'll be interesting to see. Like, I'm not sure if this whole AI explosion is going to, what that'll do to productivity. Like, will that be a big bang productivity increase? It'll be a disruptive one if it is. Like, it'll probably lead to a lot of unemployment in certain industries, etc. But yeah, I haven't quite got my head around that stuff. Like, I use ChatGPT a bit myself just for fun, but or Bing Chat. But I think the productivity is sort of going to stay weak for a long time. I can't see any way of that turning around, to be honest with you. Not with the way we run the economy. I mean, we've just got this sort of, we could basically go into the same failed economic play script that we did the last decade or the last 15 years before the pandemic. So if anything, we're doubling down on it. So if we had poor productivity in the previous decade, and we do the same stuff all over again, but with more intensity, when it comes to immigration, for example, we're obviously going to experience a similar kind of results. So, I can't see productivity improving here, and probably not across the Western world. I mean, Canada's got appalling productivity. It's running an even bigger population Ponzi than us. New Zealand's productivity is pretty poor. UK's is poor. I mean, we're all kind of in the same sort of rat wheel economy. So anyway, who cares? Get on the beers. Enjoy life.
Exactly. And I guess that's the point, because there are so many factors beyond. So China is probably looking weak. Risk. Putin's turned off wheat again, so the supply chains there could be disrupted, and that could actually put upward pressure on some of the food prices. The energy question will be quite interesting next winter in the Northern Hemisphere. Will it be as mild as last year, or will we get a more severe one? And of course, at the moment in other areas around Europe, you've got a lot of people who are struggling with very hot temperatures, same in the US and whatever. So there's lots of vagaries around there. So I think we live in uncertain times, Leith, but I like the idea of, and at the end of the day, grab a beer.
That's it. Actually, I don't really drink beer anymore, I shouldn't say. I mean, no. I'm more a gin guy these days. I'm getting too old. Beer just doesn't sit well with me anymore. I do like it, though. But, just, in the end, enjoy life. So, I sort of, look, I don't try not to worry about this sort of stuff anymore. I think maybe because I'm too busy with 2 kids and at that sort of busy stage of life, etc. I sort of, don't have enough time to worry about all this stuff. But, it's, beer and watch the cricket. That's it, mate. I've been doing too much watching the cricket lately, unfortunately. I've had too little sleep. I've actually enjoyed this long break between the 3rd and 4th test because I was running myself ragged the last 2 and getting a little bit animated. So I was actually talking with Martin about the cricket before we went on air, He's obviously in England now. And he went to Lords.
Yeah.
So I was having a whinge about David Warner and why we need to get rid of him, and and why Australia deserves to lose if we keep him. Then all my theories and why I think Pat Cummins is a great bowler and a nice bloke, but absolutely crappy captain, like really poor tactical captain. Anyway, should we turn this into a cricket podcast?
Well, maybe we should.
I can talk about cricket all day. I love it.
Yeah. No, I think we're pretty much coming up on time, Lee. So I want to say thank you very much indeed for your comments and thoughts and reactions to the chat today. Really appreciate it, as always. Always worth getting your perspective, because you were so immersed in all of this data that you're swimming through on a daily basis. And if people want to find out more about you and what you guys do, where is the best place for them to go?
Well, at the moment, I've become a bit of a media tart. So, just recently. You can find me on macrobusiness.com.au. Like that's my home. That's where I'm basically doing 99% of my stuff. So right there daily with Dave Llewellyn Smith. Just lately I've been if you watch Sky News, whatever, you probably see me on there, because I've been doing two Sky shows last week. If you're in Sydney and Brisbane, I've been on Radio 2GB, got a segment on there every Thursday morning called The Treasury of Common Sense with Luke Grant. I've been getting around a bit. Doing different media and that sort of stuff, and obviously here like once every 6 weeks or something. So just come along to Macro Business, have a read if you want to read that sort of stuff. Also, Nucleus Wealth Insights. I'll do podcasts with them probably once a month, and macrobusiness.com.au. That's the best place to find me. I'm not really into the social media stuff. You won't see me on Twitter. I have an account. I never post. I just don't like the cesspit. And nor am I on Facebook. I've got an account, but you won't really get me there because I don't use it. So just a dormant account. That's it. But yeah, thanks for having me on again, Martin. I've been a little bit more subdued tonight. Not as fired up as previously. I'm operating off about 4 hours sleep. So we've actually got a dead rat under my house at the moment. So the smell I can't get to it, and it's been driving me crazy. So that's basically it's ruined my sleep for a few nights. So I'm a little bit running on low energy at the moment.
Well, I appreciate you're coming on despite the dead rat. I hope you sort that out, because
it is horrible.
It's absolutely revolting. Absolutely, if you can't get to it. But thank you very much, and we'll do it all again sometime soon. So I'm going to take you off air now, Leith, while I just close the show. Really appreciate your time tonight. And just to tell everybody that next week, Robbie Barwick and I are going to discuss specifically this new legislation which is coming in with regard to the social media disinformation. We think this is a really important topic, so we're going to spend a bit of time on that next week on the live show. So mark your diaries for that. And what I will just do is, let's have a go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so there you go. Luna is now in that basket. Meteor has disappeared, but the doggy cams are still on, so that just gives you a bit of a flavour of what's going on here. I want to say thank you very much for spending some time with us. Thank you very much for super chats and all the comments and question and discussion. Sorry I didn't get to all the questions, but hopefully we had a representative sample, and I look forward to seeing you next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. See you next time.